It's truly a pleasure to be a part of this conference and to have it linked to the Rock Ethics Institute. As you know, this conference, Untangling Selfhood, the History and Experience of Alzheimer's Disease, marks the 100th anniversary of Alzheimer's being seen as a diagnostic category. While there will be numerous conferences marking this anniversary, this conference is unique in giving prominence to the experiences of those who have dementia or other cognitive disorders, as well as to the experiences of those who care for them. It is a hallmark of our disability studies program at Penn State to use disability as a lens to understand what it means to be human and to trace the historical and cultural differences in such conceptions of normalcy. Untangling Selfhood is sure to live up to this important hallmark by focusing on the stories we and other cultures tell about dementia and to think carefully about the ethical valences of our narratives and of our practices. And as with our disability studies program, while not ignoring the important role of biomedicine in framing approaches to and understandings of dementia, this conference aims to see the medicalization of dementia and other cognitive disorders as simply one strand in a complex fabric that goes to make up our understandings of and experiences towards cognitive disorders. The papers and presentations offered to us over the course of this two-day conference will call attention to the need for an enriched approach to Alzheimer's disease, and in particular call attention to the complex themes of selfhood and of memory and of engagement. A conference of this level of originality is generated out of the imagination as well as the hard labor of many people. And I want to thank and honor them today. First of all, Professors Janet Lyon and Michael Barabay, co-directors of the Penn State Disability Studies Program, who had this, or a conference like this in mind from the day they stepped foot on this campus. Professor Jess Ballinger, who's been instrumental in helping us think about a conference that marks the 100th anniversary of the diagnostic attention to Alzheimer's in a very different way than many other conferences are marking it, and who is active both in our program, our disability studies program, as well as in our bioethics and medical humanities program. Adair Rispoli, who served as an intern for this conference and is a graduating senior in the English department, who we are pleased to announce is going on to do graduate work in disability studies, as well as our two unflagging, always there for you staff people, Kathy Rumbaugh and Barb Edwards, who not only ensure the smooth running of this conference, but of our institute. Please thank everyone that I've just named again. Susan Squire will be introducing our first panel.
Our first panel, which is on the historical perspectives on Alzheimer's, Auguste, Deter, and the problem of selfhood and dementia. The two speakers are, in the order they're going to be speaking, Eric Engstrom. Eric Engstrom is from the Humboldt University of Berlin, and he's a research associate at the Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry in Munich, and scholar in residence at the Institute for the History of Medicine in Berlin. He's published widely on the history of psychiatry in Germany, including books on clinical psychiatry in Imperial Germany, the Charité Hospital in Berlin, and 19th century psychiatry, and he's co-editor of a multi-volume edition of the papers of the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, and his current projects include a history of forensic psychiatry in Berlin. He will be followed by Jess Ballinger, our own Jess Ballinger at Penn State, and as you already know, I hope, Jess Ballinger is the author of Self-Senility and Alzheimer's Disease in Modern America, a History, which came out last year from Johns Hopkins Press, and he also co-edited with Peter Whitehouse and Conrad Maurer, Concepts of Alzheimer's Disease, Biological, Clinical, and Cultural Perspectives. And he is currently co-editing another book with Peter Whitehouse and several other scholars entitled, Do We Have a Pill for That? Interdisciplinary Perspectives on the Development, Use, and Evaluation of Drug Treatment for Dementia. And he's an assistant professor in the Science, Technology, and Society program at Penn State University. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction and the opportunity to speak to you today about a field that I've been working in over the past 10 or 15 years or so, the history of psychiatry in Germany, although I've never dealt specifically with Alzheimer. Last night we heard a roundtable discussion about Alzheimer's disease moving beyond medicine, and this morning I'm afraid I'm going to have to take you back into the heart of medicine to an extent, and that's perhaps appropriate given the history of the past 100 years or so. The title of my topic is Researching Dementia in Imperial Germany, Alois Alzheimer, and the Economies of Psychiatric Practice. If one surveys the literature on Alois Alzheimer's life and work, one of the most common refrains has him embodying a fortuitous union of laboratory and clinical research. During his lifetime, Alzheimer himself had often stressed the need for close cooperation between pathologists and clinicians. A number of obituaries written upon his death in 1915 stressed the same thing, noting that he had been dedicated to discovering new disease processes and correlating them with clinical evidence. And more recently, Alzheimer's biographers have been eager to stress that he was not simply a bench scientist whose microscope exposed plaques and tangles, but also an empathetic and observant clinician. Now, my aim today is not so much to call these views into question, as it is to explore what it meant to be doing laboratory and clinical research on dementia in Imperial Germany. For if these commentators are correct, then we have all the more reason to ask under what conditions Alzheimer conducted his research, how laboratory and clinical work were organized, and what sorts of factors influenced the relationship between histopathological specimens on the one hand and clinical symptoms on the other. I wish to suggest that Alzheimer's work was contingent upon an ensemble of institutional arrangements and practices. As my title suggests, I understand these arrangements as part of an economy in the sense of their having to be optimized and negotiated in relation to other competing interests and priorities. The aim of my remarks today is to sketch how Alzheimer's and other psychiatrists sought to organize the conditions under which they conducted research, and to reflect on the implications of those efforts for patients' experiences. So I'll divide my paper today into four basic sections. First, I'll sketch some of the institutional arrangements in Germany at the time. I'll then talk something about what I call the politics of the psychiatric cadaver, that is, the jurisdiction over anatomic specimens. In the third section, I'll talk about hospitals as diagnostic transit stations, and the jurisdictions over clinical observation and diagnosis. And in the final section, I'll turn my remarks then back toward the theme of this conference and reflect on the implications of this research economy for patients and their experiences. So I'll begin sketching a little bit about asylums and university hospitals in Germany. One of the most distinguishing characteristics of psychiatric care in Germany after the 1860s was the rise of psychiatric clinics, and by that I mean university, teaching, and research hospitals. There's a difference in the meaning in Germany as opposed to English-speaking countries. The rise of research hospitals alongside an existing system of asylum care. There emerged, in essence, two different kinds of institution. One kind was the large state-run asylum. These institutions were charged mainly with caring for indigent patients and were conceived as models as patriarchal families. The director, or alienist, lived with the patients in an ambiguous blend of father, physician, and judge, and oversaw a moral regime of therapeutic intervention. In the ideology of the time, the asylum's rural seclusion and proximity to nature were considered essential for the reconstitution of the disordered self. The other kind of institution was the small, urban university hospital. These institutions were designed for the purposes of teaching and research. Their patients were drawn from a wider cross-section of German society, and their directors were not alienists, but psychiatrists and members of medical faculties. These two institutions, the asylum and the university clinic, embodied two different cultures of psychiatry and two different economies of psychiatric practice, with often antithetical priorities and objectives. One of the notable features of Alois Alzheimer's career was that it traversed both of these psychiatric cultures, starting off in the asylum in Frankfurt in 1888, but then moving to academic hospitals in Heidelberg and Munich in 1903. This was not an uncommon career path for psychiatrists of his generation, and it reflects the emergence of university clinics and their new cultures of research and teaching. I mention this because I believe it's relevant to Alzheimer's work on senile dementia, and let me try to explain why. In Germany, as elsewhere in Europe, asylums were severely overcrowded and chock full of what, in the jargon of the day, or with patients who, in the jargon of the day, were silting up psychiatric institutions. To a considerable degree, the rise of university clinics can be understood as a response to the challenges posed by massive institutional overcrowding. University clinics were designed to diagnose and treat short-term, curable patients in the acute phases of their illness. The chief argument justifying university clinics was that early intervention would help prevent patients from declining into chronic states, thereby reducing rates of chronicity and thus solving the problem of overcrowding. Furthermore, didactic arguments were advanced that tended to privilege acutely ill patients over chronic patients. Because university hospitals were designed to train prospective physicians, they were far more geared toward recognizing early and acute symptoms and not chronic and incurable ones. My point is that one didn't generally find cases of senile dementia in university clinics. Instead, they were far more likely to be found in custodial asylums. And for Alzheimer, this became a problem, especially after he left the Frankfurt Asylum in 1903. Alzheimer complained on several occasions that in Munich he had difficulty retaining patients. In his own words, I quote him, "Given the situation at the clinic in Munich, advanced cases of senile dementia can very rarely be examined histopathologically, because most cases of senile dementia are transferred to the asylums in the early stages of their illnesses." And again, in the same vein, to quote Alzheimer, "There are many questions that are either impossible or far more difficult to pursue in clinics than in large asylums using their richer and stabler material meaning patients." Famously, of course, Alzheimer's patient, Auguste Deter, had been admitted not to the university clinic in Munich, but to the large asylum in Frankfurt, and upon her death in 1906, her brain was sent to Alzheimer's anatomic laboratory in Munich. She was one of only a small handful of cases that Alzheimer ever examined. Historians of psychiatry have noted that when the term Alzheimer's disease was coined in 1909, there had been only 5 reported cases. Now, I'm not arguing that this paucity of anatomic evidence somehow defined what Alzheimer saw through his microscope, let alone that it determined what came to be known as Alzheimer's disease. Instead, I'm interested in the strategies that were deployed to overcome this problem of scarcity, and in what these strategies meant for patients. How did efforts to optimize conditions of psychiatric research affect patients' lives and experiences? So for the remainder of my presentation, I'll focus on 2 particular strategies. The first strategy involved efforts to secure anatomic specimens. efforts that one can describe as or that I would describe as a politics of the psychiatric cadaver. The second strategy was more clinically oriented and involved attempts to compensate for the fact that academic psychiatrists had little opportunity to observe the clinical symptoms of patients suffering from senile dementia. So first, the politics of the psychiatric cadaver. One strategy used to acquire anatomic evidence involved so-called free beds. Free beds were subsidized beds in hospitals that effectively ensured that clinicians could retain patients and prevent them from being discharged. As such, they were extremely valuable to laboratory researchers in neuropathology. Having such subsidized beds liberated psychiatrists from the apparent whims of penny-pinching state authorities or families who might have their relatives transferred to other, less expensive institutions. Free beds enabled psychiatrists to attract and retain patients that they deemed to be of great psychiatric interest. These beds sometimes served, in effect, as a kind of death row for patients. They represented an administrative mechanism which made it easier to delay discharge or transfer and thus acquire the anatomic specimens they hoped to examine. Such arrangements were common at psychiatric teaching hospitals throughout Germany, prompting critics to complain that psychiatrists were pursuing an outright cadaver policy. Clinics also regulated access to cadavers through contractual arrangements. Shortly after Alzheimer arrived in Munich, a contract was drawn up between the psychiatric clinic and the Institute of Pathology. The contract set down the procedures to be followed for all psychiatric autopsies. It stipulated acceptable locations for the autopsies. It laid out the respective jurisdictions over various body parts and set up proper procedures of documentation. Less formal relationships were also important. After moving to Munich, Alzheimer continued to rely on the director of the asylum in Frankfurt to supply him with specimens and other patient data. This reflects the distinctly hierarchical relationship that was evolving in German psychiatry, with asylums delivering up pathological specimens to centralized research facilities. All of these arrangements comprised the mechanisms that regulated access to cadavers and secured professional jurisdiction over laboratory research work. Free beds, delayed discharge, formal contracts, informal networks were all attempts on the part of psychiatric researchers to secure control over cadavers and facilitate anatomic research. Negotiating these arrangements was part of the politics of the psychiatric cadaver, and implementing the requisite mechanisms, part of an economy of psychiatric practice. It would appear that Alzheimer's famous patient Auguste Deter was caught up in just such mechanisms. 2 attempts were made to transfer her to a less expensive asylum in Weilmünster. First, shortly after her admission in 1901, her husband applied for transfer, and in 1904, after she had apparently become a charge of the state, local courts again sought to have her transferred. On both occasions, Alzheimer and the director of the Frankfurt asylum, Ines Zioli, intervened to prevent the transfer, presumably in anticipation of her demise and the prospect of obtaining valuable pathological specimens. So that's the first strategy. The second strategy I want to talk about are hospitals as diagnostic transit stations. Researching senile dementia was hampered not just by difficulties in acquiring anatomic specimens. It was also shackled by problems of observing patient symptoms in a clinical setting, not least because university hospitals were designed to diagnose and treat acute patients. A case in point was the new university hospital in Munich, where Alzheimer worked from 1903 to 1912. When it opened, its director and Alzheimer's mentor, Emil Kraepelin, took important steps to ensure that the hospital would be an effective teaching and research hospital. Most importantly, he insisted that virtually no restrictions were placed on admission and discharge of patients. By insisting on easy, unbureaucratic admission of patients, he hoped to ensure that patients' early or prodromal symptoms could be observed in a clinical setting. And by insisting on unrestricted discharge of patients, he hoped to prevent, I quote him, the accumulation of clinically useless cases, that is, the cases that can't be used for purposes of education, or psychiatric research. Furthermore, Kraepelin sought to hike the frequency or the flow of patients through his hospital in support of expressly quantitative clinical research agenda, or of his research agenda. Kraepelin sought to admit, diagnose, and discharge as many patients as possible in order to gather clinical data across the entire spectrum of psychopathology. For him, the university clinic was a diagnostic transit station that admitted large numbers of patients, diagnosed them, and then distributed them to an array of other secondary institutions for specific care and treatment. This clinical research agenda clearly was in clear conflict with Alzheimer's laboratory interests of patient retention to secure anatomic specimens. Furthermore, high patient frequency, that implies also shorter hospital stays, made it more difficult to observe patients over extended periods of time. Because of the slow progression of their illnesses, more often than not, patients suffering from senile dementia were simply shunted through academic clinics to second-tier custodial institutions. Consequently, when it came to clinical observation of cases of senile dementia, there loomed a gaping hole in the empirical evidence base. Both Kraepelin and Alzheimer were acutely aware of this problem and worked hard to compensate for it. Most importantly, they enlisted the support of alienists. From the outset in 1903, they assiduously courted them, initiating exchange programs for asylum doctors, scientific evenings, and cooperative research endeavors. In this way, they built a network of personal contacts across the system of regional psychiatric care that allowed them to keep track of patients long after they had left the Munich hospital. Together with other colleagues in Munich, Alzheimer's worked on a number of joint research projects with alienists, but these projects were fraught with difficulties. Alzheimer never saw the patients in distant asylums. He and his co-workers had to rely on patient files, and those files had been compiled by third-party observers using different kinds of record-keeping. And they often contained gaps in the clinical picture that extended over years. Nothing had presumably happened for 2, 3, 4 years. All of this suggests that Alzheimer's ability to bring laboratory and clinical research together was plagued with difficulties. It also suggests that something important in the alienist research culture had gone missing in university hospitals, namely the psychiatrist who had spent a lifetime living and working amongst patients and who did not need to document the course of their illness, let alone to diagnose it. Interestingly, some 19th century alienists never diagnosed their patients at all. There was no need to. But arguably, those same alienists had acquired profound knowledge of their patients' lives and illnesses, knowledge that Alzheimer and other academic psychiatrists could not acquire. So let me close my remarks now by reflecting on some of the implications of all this for patients, for their experiences, and our historical understanding of Alzheimer's. The fact that most clinics had no remit to treat incurable patients meant that patients with dementia usually passed silently through clinics on their way to custodial institutions. But insofar as they were found in university clinics, they were usually there either for their didactic usefulness in training students or for the prospective pathological specimens they would deliver. One observer has recently suggested that the dialogue that unfolded between Alzheimer and his patients, and we saw a clip yesterday about this, was remarkably broad and has drawn parallels between Alzheimer and how doctors today query their patients. While I can't comment on contemporary doctor-patient dialogue, Alzheimer worked in conditions that left little time or opportunity for doctors to engage with patients. Regardless of whether he was a caring, empathetic physician or not, he worked, and consciously chose to work, in institutions that tended to impoverish the possibilities of greater doctor-patient rapport. I'm sure that much of what I've spoken about today sounds fairly abhorrent to our contemporary sensibilities. But we should be wary of judging the past by the standards of our present. Last night's roundtable discussion, and indeed this conference, is framed in terms of moving beyond medicine. What I've done, however, is taking you back and giving you a story of Alzheimer's on the very cusp of its medicalization. The challenge that historians face is, in some sense, to forget that we are today trying to move beyond medicine and imagine a time when Alzheimer's was just becoming medicalized and try to understand how and why that happened. Demonizing German psychiatrists in the early 20th century rarely helps us to understand their motives. Nor, however, do we necessarily have occasion to laud them as the saviors of humanity. Large swaths of popular medical history trade on the idea that scientific and medical progress will bring ever better cures for our ailments. Studying the emergence of Alzheimer's as a disease is revealing for what it tells us about how this promise of scientific progress unfolded. Not least the problems that Alzheimer confronted in his research contributed to a distinctly anticipatory, or you might say proleptic, discourse. That is to say, because there was no cure for the disorder, the solutions which Alzheimer and others offered up were chronically anticipatory, perpetually holding out the prospect of more effective treatments in the future. That he and others since managed to keep this anticipatory engine in gear was in part due to the successive waves of new technologies that generated fascinating new images and invasive possibilities. Then the microscope, today MRI, fMRI, and the whole imaging industry. History can help us recognize the anticipatory structure of this discourse, and thus help us to manage our hopes and find a better balance between unrealistic expectations and appropriate optimism. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Eric, for a terrific talk. I want to myself go a little bit beyond medicine in a different way. I want to try to sketch out today historically how an idea, I think one of the animating ideas that this conference is a reaction to, and part of a kind of a larger corrective that's going on, is this idea that somehow selfhood is gone or destroyed in dementia, that somehow the person with dementia is no longer really there, no longer really a person. As an American historian, my contribution to this corrective has been to try to understand the fear that's developed around dementia, and in particular understand when and why this tendency to think of people with dementia as no longer there emerged in American society and culture. And what I've come to argue is that this tendency has deeper historical roots than the efforts to push the disease into public consciousness in the 1980s, which most of us are very familiar with, and it certainly became most explicitly expressed and widely accepted. Rather, I find that the line dividing the person with dementia from the rest of us has been drawn gradually from the mid-19th century through our own time as part of a broader transformation and negotiation of meanings for selfhood and aging in American society and culture, and it only culminates in the emergence of Alzheimer's in the 1980s. In the United States, at least, the roots of the way we look at old age in general and dementia in particular lie in broader changes associated with the triumph of a modern liberal social order in the late 19th century. In earlier periods, a person's identity throughout their life was determined fairly directly by an established social hierarchy, whether rooted in a Protestant piety in New England or a patriarchal hierarchy of landed wealth in the Chesapeake or in the South. These social contexts provided a relatively high acceptance of infirmities associated with aging, including dementia. As historian Thomas Cole has put it, acknowledgement of the intractable sorrows and infirmities of age remained culturally acceptable as long as men and women lived in families, churches, and communities regulated by principles of hierarchy, dependency, and reciprocal obligation. Both ideas of selfhood and meaning for the losses that often accompany old age were challenged as such communities were transformed by urbanization, a more geographically and socially mobile population, and industrialization. In the emerging social context of a liberal, cosmopolitan social order, selfhood was problematic in ways it hadn't been before. Selfhood was no longer an ascribed status, something you were born into, and that was maintained by the world a person lived in. Rather, selfhood had to be carefully and willfully constructed by every individual. Self-construction was further complicated in the late 19th century by the complex demands that emerging hierarchies associated with processes like industrial production, bureaucratic forms of governance, and the mass media, mass consumption placed on the individual. I see you approaching me. Okay, thank you. As this project of self-creation grew increasingly problematic in the late 19th century, the loss of the ability to independently sustain a coherent self-narrative, which dementia entails, came to seem much more frightening, maybe the most frightening thing, most frightening loss that a person could face. Senility, I would argue, increasingly haunted the landscape of the self-made man. As this slide shows, at the same time, new patterns of work were challenging traditional meanings of old age. Beginning in the second half of the 19th century and increasingly throughout the 20th century, the meaning of old age takes shape in the context of growing debate over the productivity of older workers, the purported difficulty they had in keeping pace with technological change, and whether modern corporations needed to adopt policies of mandatory retirement. These issues never got settled completely, of course, and they've remained contested down to the present. But nonetheless, a stereotype of senility takes shape and solidifies around the terms of this debate. From the late 19th century to the present, this image of the senile, especially the senile man, who because of his slowly decaying brain, was hopelessly unable to keep up with society, has been perhaps the dominant feature of public discourse about aging. A clear example of this stereotype can be found in the work of George Miller Beard, the New York neurologist who anyone who studies American history knows as the popularizer of the diagnosis of neurasthenia, an ailment that is usually seen as kind of emblematic of late 19th century anxiety about the pace of modern industrial society. In a book called Legal Responsibility in Old Age, which was published in 1874 and later incorporated into his much more popular book, American Nervousness, 1881, Beard claimed to have analyzed the biographies of 750 prominent individuals from every area of human endeavor to derive what he called the law of the relation of age to work, which revealed, he claimed, that aging brought about a catastrophic decline in intellectual productivity. Beard concluded that, like the rest of the body, the brain and the mental and moral faculties which depended on it were subject to deterioration, and in fact would normally do so more rapidly than the rest of the body. Men die as trees die, he argued, slowly and frequently at the top first. As the moral and reasoning faculties are the highest, most complex, and most delicate development of human nature, they are the first to show signs of cerebral disease. When they begin to decay in advanced life, we are generally safe in predicting that if neglected, other faculties will sooner or later be impaired. When conscience is gone, the constitution may soon follow. Beard argued that the loss of intellectual power made old men susceptible to a variety of moral failings. One becomes peevish, another avaricious, another misanthropic, another mean and tyrannical, another exacting and querulous, another sensual, another cold and cruelly conservative, another vain and ambitious, and others simply lose their moral enthusiasm or their moral courage or their capacity of resisting temptation and enduring disappointment. So Beard here is representing the senile man in a number of characteristic guises. miser, tyrant, fool, lecher, all of which were characterized by the loss of self-control, which, of course, had become the fundamental ordering principle of American culture as external authorities were eroded under this transforming society. Whatever the particular form, Beard represented the senile as hopelessly out of step with the times, failing to fulfill the complex intellectual and moral tasks required of a man in modern society. The senile were ultimately an obstruction to progress. Overall, this rather impressive catalog of moral and intellectual failures that physicians like Beard used to illustrate senility can be seen as kind of a catalog of late 19th and early 20th century middle-class anxieties about masculinity, a masculinity that was imperiled by progress. The stereotypical representations of the senile man, as presented by Beard, remained dominant in medical and popular text through the 1940s. It can clearly be seen, for example, in William Osler's infamous joke. William Osler, the perhaps most famous physician around the turn of the 20th century, that men, having forfeited their productivity and creativity as they age, ought to be euthanized at the age of 60. And this is a popular song written. There was tremendous controversy around this that Osler really was never able to entirely live down. It followed him across the Atlantic. It was a joke in some ways. He was joking about the euthanasia. He was not joking about what he believed about productivity. Anyway, this kind of image, whether in a joke such as Osler's, it also persists in textbooks. You can find it in Nasher's Geriatrics, generally seen as the first modern geriatric textbook, 1914. And many gerontologists have argued that it's persisted as a salient image of aging down till today. There's much that I ought to say if I keep saying masculinity in man, and there's a lot I could say about gender that I'm not going to be able to, but just to point out that the prescriptive domesticity of women kept them in some ways outside of this discourse about being left behind, because the grandmother, who remained useful as an anchor to hearth and home, as you can see in this piece of sheet music, still had some utility, still had some worth in calling people out of this competitive sphere of the liberal capitalist competitive order back home to something stable. So grandmothers are sort of immune to this senility in some way. The great irony being, I only point this out, the other reason I point this out is the great irony is by the 1930s in medical literature it's well established. So it's discussed discursively as a male problem. Ironically, by the 1930s already it is known that there is a higher prevalence among women for various forms of dementia. So just kind of an irony there. So the reason understanding this basic stereotype of the senile is crucial to understanding the subsequent history of dementia and Alzheimer's is that this image of the senile emerged around the turn of the century. It constituted the problem at which much research and policy in the 20th century has been aimed in the psychiatry of the 1930s and 40s, and especially in the field of gerontology that's emerging around this time. The stereotype of senility was itself regarded as one of the most significant problems facing the elderly. In the mid-1930s, psychiatry remained stymied in making any sort of progress in understanding the biological causes of senile dementia and Alzheimer's disease. But following the general trend toward psychodynamic psychiatry and psychoanalysis in the U.S., a group of psychiatrists forged a distinctly new approach to senile dementia that emphasized psychosocial factors over neuropathology in the etiology of dementia. Dementia was more than the simple and inevitable outcome of a brain that was deteriorating with the process of aging and or disease. Dementia, in this view, was a dialectical process between the brain and the mind and the social context in which the aging person was situated. The locus of senile mental deterioration was no longer the aging brain. Instead, it was a society that stripped the elderly of the roles that had sustained meaning in their lives, through mandatory retirement, social isolation, and the disintegration of the traditional family. Bereft of any meaningful social role, the demented elderly did not so much lose their minds as lose their place in the world. In the 50s, gerontologists and their allies in the academic, medical, social service, and business professions who embraced their ideals, passionately attacking what they saw as the social pathology of senility. This attack involved improving the material circumstances of old age through increasing public and private pensions, abolishing mandatory retirement, establishing a network of social and recreational services, and perhaps most importantly, replacing the negative image of senility, which generated hostility and fear toward the elderly, with positive images of successful aging, which generated the optimistic attitude necessary for the individual and society to meet the challenge of aging. Geriatrician Martin Gumpert, whose quote I put up there a bit prematurely, was one of the most energetic and visible proponents of the attack on senility, and he argued that the crucial factor was for people to realize that freedom from senility was possible. If people are asked whether they would like to live for 100 or 120 or 150 years, most of them seem horrified. Why? They are frightened by the grotesque ugliness, the obscenity, the misery of senility, the hell in which so many beloved ones languish before they die. They look with fear into the mirror that reveals the first symptoms of old age, and they would give their souls to arrest its ravages. Now, whether we've, in fact, given our souls up to arrest these ravages might be a question worth considering. But in any event, by the 1970s, much of the post-World War II gerontological program had, in fact, been accomplished, creating what Peter Laslett has called a third age. Other gerontologists have called the young old, elderly people, typically under age 85, whose continued good health and prosperity leaves them ample opportunity to pursue a fulfilling life. The material circumstances of old age had markedly improved. Significant legal protections had been won against age discrimination in the labor market, and negative stereotypes had been challenged. And the elderly themselves were organizing for political advocacy and action on their own behalf. And it was these developments really that set the stage for the emergence of Alzheimer's disease as a major disease entity and as a major public issue in the 1980s. To gerontologists and aging advocates in the 1970s, late 1970s, the broad concept of senility that had been central to gerontologists in previous decades was no longer acceptable. Aging activists were demanding that the health of older people be taken as seriously as the health of anyone else. And nowhere was this demand more strident than in the case of senility, which by the end of the 1970s seemed more an ageist epithet than a medical concept. Senility had become a wastebasket term into which all of the problems of aging that people didn't want to deal with could be dumped. Clinicians and biomedical scientists thus broke the broad concept of senility down into various discrete, well-defined disease entities that, at least in theory, no longer contaminated the entire experience of aging. And the most prominent of these, of course, was going to be Alzheimer's disease. And that really is kind of the culmination of the social transformation that I've sketched out here. And there's much to say about the social construction and career of Alzheimer's disease as a disease concept that I don't really have time to go into. I suspect Peter may refer to some of that in his talk. The one thing to say, though, is that at least on one ground, it has been wildly successful. It certainly became remarkably, despite a rather unlikely name to become a household word. Alzheimer's disease has become virtually a household word, and it has been tremendously effective as kind of a focal point for lobbying for research funding. So research funding went from less than $1 million in 1976 to something over $700 million today. So, but I want to conclude by pointing out that it has not been successful at removing or reducing the anxiety and fear associated with aging, and has probably in fact intensified the marginalization of people with associated cognitive problems. The biomedical researchers, family members, and professional caregivers, pharmaceutical companies, and policymakers who worked so hard to heighten public consciousness about Alzheimer's disease assumed that one of the benefits of their work would be to lessen the stigma attached to both old age and dementia. Dementia was most often caused by a disease, Alzheimer's, a disease that, though more prevalent among older people, did not inevitably afflict them. Knowing this, they thought, would relieve most older people of needless concern that they would lose their minds as they aged, while generating greater understanding and genuine sympathy for those who do suffer from dementia. But in emphasizing what was particularly dreadful about Alzheimer's disease, the Alzheimer's movement reinvigorated stereotypical representations of senility that have circulated in American society and culture since the late 19th century. The anguish of Alzheimer's disease was not simply caused by the pain and humiliation it added to a life. All chronic disease does that. Alzheimer's disease was the worst of all diseases for what it took away, memory and language, the very essence of selfhood, or so it was represented. And this loss of self was a ubiquitous trope in the public culture of Alzheimer's disease through the 1980s. When Lewis Thomas famously made the case that Alzheimer's was the disease of the century, his argument was not just about prevalence rates, but about the particularly horrible nature of the disease. It is the worst of all diseases, not just for what it does to the patient, but for its devastating effects on families and friends. It begins with the loss of learned skills, arithmetic and typing, for instance, and progresses inexorably to a total shutting down of the mind. It is not in itself lethal, unmercifully. Patients go on and on living, essentially brainless but otherwise healthy, into advanced age unless lucky enough to be saved by pneumonia. That's a pretty harsh representation. It suffused this slogans and iconography that surrounded the disease, slogans such as the funeral that never ends, graphic images like this one from the Alzheimer's Association, showing a series of identical close-up photos of an attractive woman, evidently in her mid-50s, fading from sharp black and white to gray, the last image virtually blank, visually capturing that notion that the person is gone, the person is disappearing. As stereotypes of senility had since the late 19th century, stereotypical representations of Alzheimer's disease hinged on broader anxieties about selfhood that have been particularly intense in American society, the fear of losing it, of failing to present a stable and coherent self. The well-intentioned effort of many experts to destigmatize Alzheimer's disease by pointing out that the unpleasant changes associated with it are the result of damage to the brain and are usually beyond the control of the patient could, of course, not be of much help, because the loss of self-control and even selfhood itself was precisely what was the thing most feared and most stigmatized in Alzheimer's disease. Consider the kind of thing that you could find in a supermarket about Alzheimer's disease: the living death. They steal, they shoplift, they're violent, they expose themselves in public, they're verbally abusive, they lie and they don't know any better. Meet some of the 4 million Americans who have Alzheimer's disease in the pages of The Living Death. Collectively, in fact, stereotypical representations of Alzheimer's disease have a lot in common with representations of senility that emerged in the late 19th century, and trade on the same set of broader anxieties about the problematic nature of selfhood in the modern world. In this context, scientific representations of Alzheimer's disease merely sharpened the fear and stigma of Alzheimer's disease, the putative precision and certainty of science reinforcing the idea that there's something very real and definite in the changes in the brain that are dividing the normal from those with dementia from the rest of us. And these kind of images, iconic graphic images of PET scans, are again virtually everywhere in Alzheimer's disease discourse these days. Well, to conclude, I want to point out that I just want to point out in passing, I'm going to skip over the drug part. People with dementia are beginning to challenge this themselves, increasingly with early diagnosis, People are able to write book-length memoirs. There's at least, I think, about a dozen people who have done so far, and I think we're going to see more and more of that as diagnoses occur earlier on. And finally, I want to suggest that the history I've sketched out should blur the bright line that has divided those with dementia from the rest of us. Our way of seeing dementia is driven by deep and disabling fears, anxiety about the need for self-control and self-fulfillment. Through our own intelligence and effort leads us to doubt the selfhood of the cognitively impaired. As people with dementia lose the ability to articulate a coherent narrative that connects their present with the past, to turn their desires into a rational plan that connects the present to the future, and ultimately to control their most basic physical impulses, their selfhood seems to evaporate in the suffocating atmosphere of an eternally desolate now. As witnesses to these catastrophic losses, our own memory fails. We have no trouble recalling things, citing the many incidents that marked the trajectory of this deterioration. We know that the person with dementia is the same person, yet we find it excruciatingly difficult to construct a narrative that connects the demented person we see before us with the self-possessed person we knew. Quite literally, we have trouble remembering or fitting together the demented person with his or her past, and so we speak, however nonsensically, of the person as being someone or something else, as no longer really there, despite the troubling persistence of their body. In this way, dementia can be seen to create a disruption of memory for both the cognitively impaired and those of us around them who persist in being called normal. In the face of such catastrophic losses, it seems an affront to the dignity of all that an individual was to claim that he or she continues to be the same person in advanced dementia. In the face of anxiety about our own selfhood, we may find it difficult to see them as persons at all. Over the coming decades, we're going to struggle individually and collectively with increasing numbers of people with dementia. Part of our challenge will be to heal ourselves, to find some grounds for selfhood that transcend the limits of our own fantasies about rationality, control, and fulfillment. In this struggle, we will have much to learn from the experience of people with dementia.
If the speakers sit there, and I'll field questions for both of them. We have about 15 minutes. So, yeah, Jillian.
I was wondering if you all, you both gave really fabulous accounts of what was happening in America and what was happening in Germany. And I'm wondering if you could comment on any kind of interaction between the two places that might have influenced either one.
Well, I'm guessing you may know this much better, but there was a lot of American researchers who went and studied in Alzheimer's lab. Solomon Fuller, perhaps some would argue the first African American. It's always you. First African-American psychiatrist worked in Alzheimer's lab, I think Thomas Baird. So a number of people who in the early decades published on senile dementia and Alzheimer's disease here, in fact, worked in Alzheimer's lab. I think there's a tremendous connection, and that lab is, I'm thinking, is kind of an early hub for kind of the global diffusion of knowledge, but I bet you know a lot more about it.
Well, you're absolutely right. There was an enormous exchange of knowledge going on. A lot of Americans coming to Germany at this time to study under Kraepelin in particular. And German science had the reputation at that time of being world leading, and Germans, were eager to sort of also facilitate that kind of thinking about their institutions. And so they did have sort of this leadership mentality in the clinics that they constructed. And one of the things that Kraepelin did was he created a research institute itself, and that research institute invited scholars from around the world to work and study under him and with his colleagues. So I think there was an enormous exchange of ideas going on there. As far as the sort of cultural issues of anxiety that you were talking talking about. I'm not so sure that there's Beard that sort of gets moved across the Atlantic to Germany, and is read in different ways, read in a much more pessimistic, cultural pessimistic way in terms of degeneration than it is read as a sort of optimistic, nervous individual, get up and go and can do kind of, right? So there's that kind of difference also going on, I think.
Just another connection I want to highlight, and why it's so important to pay attention to the sort of things that Eric has to say, is that you began in your talk by talking about you were a little kinder, but the kind of mythos of Alzheimer, and he being the founding father of our own initiative, is something that's sort of simplified gloss on history's heritage. It's all over the kind of discourse that I'm, giving a critical read of as well. So it's really important to pay attention to history as a sort of reality check.
Reality check, right?
You have to have this.
Okay. I have kind of a two-part question, comment kind of thing that's forming in my head as I say it, so I apologize. I was struck by what you said about, I think you were talking about the 19th century, where it seemed to be okay. Dementia was okay as long as the people stayed within the family framework.
Yeah, I don't want to say that was good.
But I wonder about, it seems to me we're still in that same thing today, that people strive really hard. I mean, you talk to family members and they will do anything. They make incredible promises to keep people at home, that there's any kind of, but there's such a tremendous fight to keep people at home as long as they possibly can before they have to surrender them to an institution. And I'm also struck by, I directed a stage reading of Conrad Mauer's play about the initial diagnosis situation, and I remember the husband of Auguste coming in and saying several times, I need to move her, this is too expensive, I can't afford this, why should I keep her here? And was really struck by sort of the institutional repetition of that. And now we're sort of also in a parallel situation where people are living at home, and so all the people we study are usually people who are in institutions from the research side, because that's where you have most of the information on people. So we have we don't understand how many, 70% of the people with dementia who are living at home, largely, we just don't have as much access to them. So it's a similar situation of the struggle to get information on who the people are and the size and scope of the disease. So those are just kind of observations if you have reactions to them.
I'd agree.
Yeah.
Jesse, you asked rhetorically whether we're willing to sell our soul for the answer to Alzheimer's. And Eric, you mentioned that Alzheimer and other German physicians were responsible for the moral climate of their clinics or asylums. I'm reminded that I used to tell the medical students that the theory in the 1800s about what caused dementia was excessive work, drinking, and excessive masturbation. Because there was a theory of moral degeneracy that preceded this evolution of brain psychiatry. So I do think that moral issues are really important to understand, because I think there are a lot of what we might call bioethical issues that may or may not be addressed by bioethicists going on today. So what was this theory of morals, and what was the role of the physician in the moral climate of the therapeutic environment?
I can briefly say in the American context, there's a tradition of faculty psychology which views, I forget just how many different, and obviously very involved, different faculties, the moral faculty, the reasoning faculty, the language faculty. In some ways, this is a predecessor to brain localization, sort of gets mapped on. But when Beard is talking about moral faculties, he's drawing on that tradition of faculty. Psychology, talking about moral competence as sort of a distinct and isolable thing in the brain, separate from maybe reasoning. So, I mean, that's the tradition drawing on in the American context.
Well, I mean, in Germany, it's been remarked by many historians that Kraepelin's ideas were very strongly influenced by Morel, the French alienist. And, the theory sort of runs that what happens as Morel's ideas were moved from France into Germany is that they were medicalized and secularized. So what you have happening in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s is with the rise of some more biological anatomic psychiatry, you have this Morelian moral world staying intact, but it being sort of drained of its moral content in many respects and medicalized. And I think that's what's really going on with Kraepelin. You have the same sort of value judgments going on in many respects, but they're overlain or displaced by sort of biological facts, if you will. And also moral. You can also think of moral issues in terms of the authority of doctors to speak to the whole issue of dementia itself. And I think that the status of academics in Germany was particularly high, and that they derived from that this authority, also this moral authority to speak to social issues of the day, and particularly speak to the anxieties of the populace about degeneration, decline, and civilization going to the dogs, essentially.
I kind of wonder if we aren't at a point of moralizing again diseases as we move from a period of time in which you had very hugely successful medical advances, particularly in the face of infectious disease, etc., to a time when we're now emphasizing chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension and perhaps Alzheimer's itself, shrouded in a language of at risk and etc. and the whole behavioral modification. Elias Zerhouni, the director of NIH, saying this is the time when we need to investigate how to go about helping people to employ the kinds of behavioral changes they need to work with these diseases. But all of that implies that I somehow am in control of, to some extent, what is going on for me. And even Alzheimer's disease has this kind of tint to it in the sense that once we figure out that more exercise and good diet, etc., are in part responsible for staving off the disease, they also become partly responsible for acquiring the disease. And I wonder if we aren't at a point of this kind of remoralization of chronic diseases, and particularly this one, a chronic neurodegenerative disease.
I'm not sure we've ever entirely been without that sort of moralization of disease. Pretty much anywhere I look, even tracing what people are saying about senility, there's always a trope in there about taking care of your brain and sort of taking responsibility and various sorts of habits different in different eras. What is being demonized? But I'm always seeing that pretty much anywhere I look since then.
It's in Germany, especially Kraepelin. And Kraepelin was was a temperance advocate. And this whole issue of sort of watching out, taking care of yourself, not getting into trouble, not drinking and engaging in sexual activity and so on and so forth, is just everywhere at this time.
We have time for one more quick question.
I don't think either of you really responded to Peter's question. Think of Pick's book, The Idea of Degeneracy. Degeneracy was an immensely powerful idea at the end of the 19th century, particularly in Europe. And this tied in with genetic determinism, social Darwinism, the entire eugenics movement. So relating that to senility and to Alzheimer's, what was that about? My view is that that's the basis for how that entire movement in Germany got to life unworthy of life. And so what is that degeneracy, and how does that come in? And I'm right with Peter on this. I think this is really where the moral dimension is most powerfully exposed.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Eugenics. Kraepelin is involved in, and Alzheimer implicitly, in sort of trying to bring the anatomic foundation to Kraepelin's categories, is involved in a eugenics project very clearly. And one of the things I didn't talk about today were all of the strategies that Kraepelin also employs to do epidemiological research on larger populations. He's engaging courts, juvenile detention facilities, all sorts of other institutions in order to acquire data on patients so that he can analyze large population groups in a project that is really about engineering a healthy populace. And so I would agree that's absolutely central. But I mean, there's this whole issue also of selfhood, and there's been a book on feeble-mindedness in England by, I think, Matthew Thompson. And Matthew Thompson, drawing on the work of Nicholas Rose, has made the argument that what the whole discourse about feeble-mindedness in England was not so much about eugenics, but about sort of reinforcing selfhood and creating a democratic subject in some sense. Here is a vulnerable individual, and if we construct that vulnerable individual, we sort of reconfirm our own autonomy and our own democratic status, if you will. I mean, I've spoken of this in my book in terms of bedlamic Orientalism, okay? In terms of looking at the psychiatric patient in order to sort of confirm our own sense of identity. So there's a tension, what I'm getting at is that there's a tension between sort of this function of psychology and psychiatric diagnosis in reinforcing our sense of selfhood on one hand, but there's also this whole eugenics discourse that's going on there as well. And there's, I think, a divide between what happens on the continent and what happens in maybe Western democracies, which is important, that hasn't really been studied that much yet. So.
I would say that I think the importance of the question you're reiterating, perhaps more forcefully, that Peter first brought up, I think it's crucial. I think it's one of the animating reasons for this conference, that whenever there begins to be a common sense that there is a form of life not worth living, we had better step back and, as intellectuals, and examine that. And that is the case with dementia. I would, Patty Satalia mentioned Dr. Kevorkian's first client, Janet Atkins. When you read the ensuing bioethical discourse around that, one of the striking things is no one ever questions her decision. In fact, I mean, sort of the most extreme variant was she was installed, I forget just by who now, as a heroine of rational action. I forget just the terminology, but she was installed as taking that last bit of control of her life and kind of trying to reason. So, in that sort of unwillingness to interrogate whether a decision to end your life was almost sacrosanct in the discussion. It was all about Kevorkian and Kevorkian. But the idea that it made sense to end one's life then was